Okay, so here we go into what is going to be one of the longer chapters that we cover. All right, I've done a bunch of testing on my video and sound quality. I think things should sync up. There is a bit of a problem as I'm filming that it's off, but I think that's translating to a better recording. So guys, just understand I'm working on this. This is a work in progress. So please bear with me. Y'all have been really, really kind about this so far, and I hope that you'll continue to do so. So, Chapter 7. This is the, I would say the climax chapter. Okay, yeah, let's go ahead and say that. Definitely going to get our biggest events, and we're going to see major changes from the beginning to the end of this chapter. It's also quite a long one, so you guys need to bear with me as we get through it, okay? So we're beginning with a big change. For the first time in forever, as far as Nick can notice, Gatsby's lights are off in his house. You know, it's always been lit up, so it was welcoming and inviting people over. But now that he's had Daisy come over and he's gotten what he wanted, he has no reason to continue that part of his life. So the lights are off. In fact, when Nick goes by to check on him, the servants there are all new, and they don't recognize Nick, and who's been over there a lot before. And they kind of blow him off. So a little bit later, Gatsby actually calls over there. I guess he got word that Nick came to call on him. And he basically tells him that these are all new servants. They actually worked for Wolfsheim. They're some of his people, which indicates how shady what he's doing is. But he says that basically they've got, I said basically a lot, I'm sorry about that. They are good at keeping things quiet. And remember now, while Gatsby may not care if people know what's going on, Daisy's going to, because she's from East Egg. Remember, and these people care a lot about things being their reputation and keeping things sound. And so at this point, it seems like Daisy's okay running away with Gatsby when the time presents itself, because she thinks it's not going to ding her relationship too much because she's leaving one rich guy for another rich guy. So right now, but it hasn't come out yet. She doesn't want to mark herself yet. So a little bit after that, both Gatsby and Daisy invite Nick over to Daisy's for lunch. Daisy particularly seems really glad Nick is coming, which Nick sees as, this is about to be that point where they're going to have this out and they're finally going to tell Tom what's going on. And I guess Nick's there to keep from there being a, violent outburst is what they're hoping. So, in other words, Nick is worried that the proverbial crap is about to hit the fan. And because he knew that this was going to happen. Gatsby told him this is what he was going to do. So, when they get there, Tom's on the phone fighting with George Wilson. He's fighting with him about this sale of the car, which, remember, that is George's ticket to anything. I won't say it's ticket out, but it's his ticket to a better life. And so if Tom takes this away from him, he's in trouble. So, that right there gives us a little bit of hint of something we're going to see in a few minutes. All right? Jordan's convinced that this is all an act. She thinks he's actually on the phone with Myrtle, but Nick's trying to defend him at this point. While this is going on, Daisy just flirts with Gatsby, with Tom right there in the room. Tom walks out and she walks over and tells Gatsby she loves him. Things like this are definitely not what you want to do if you're trying to keep an affair secret. Sorry, let me take this down a little bit. All right, there we go. Sorry, I like to keep the book there too, so all right. Definitely not what you want to do if you're trying to stay somewhat secretive about your actions. So that happens, and then we get some thunder. Then we get a really, really disturbing scene that was not conveyed in the movie, by the way. And that's when the daughter shows back up. And we finally get her name, which is Pammy. But before we get her name, she gets referred to as the child and she several times. And Daisy really treats her in a way that makes her seem like she's just a prop. Like she's just showing her off. Now, why does Fitzgerald include this? Well, not to say that Daisy's a bad mom, just so that you know. It's really more about seeing Gatsby's reaction to the daughter. Okay, Gatsby, it's like seeing her completely throws him because that's not part of his fantasy about the past. He wants Daisy 5 years ago. Daisy 5 years ago didn't have a child. So it's like it finally clicks for him that things are different. And I know it seems like he should realize that, but he doesn't, okay? At that point, Gatsby takes Daisy out to the end of her pier and points at how he's across the bay from her. Now, if you had read this book with no help and no kind of knowledge of it, at this point the green light thing would set in. That's what he was reaching across the bay towards way back in chapter 1. All right, so we're getting a lot of early loose ends tied up in this chapter. All right. Okay, so then we get one of my favorite lines, and I don't know why it's one of my favorite lines. All right, well I do know why. It has nothing to do with the book. Okay, Let me read it to you. Not the first part is not. This is Daisy talking. She says, "What will we do with ourselves this afternoon?" cried Daisy, "and the day after that, and the next 30 years." So right away, what a rich person thing to say. Like, I don't know what we're going to do today. And really, what will we do the next 30 years? They're in their late 20s, early 30s now. So basically for the majority of their life, what are they going to do? Because they have the options of choices here. Now, here's the line I love. "Don't be morbid," Jordan said. "Life starts all over again when it gets crisp in the fall." Now, I love that. When I used to have social media, as soon as it started getting cool, that would always be something I would quote. I love it. It also kind of parallels what we saw way back in the beginning when Nick talks about things being new in the summer. So now we're seeing the fall, which these two are opposites. Well, they're not opposites, but kind of, okay? So Jordan pointing out that everything changes in the fall. In other words, they don't have to make decisions. Everything's new for them. We turn around. In all honesty, not a really major section to talk about, but I love the fall, so that one works really well for me. Then something weird happens. Gatsby and Daisy kind of lock eyes, and Tom's in the room. And Tom's not as stupid as we all think he is, and he catches something. So let me read it to you. It says, "She had told him that she loved him, and Tom Buchanan saw. He was astounded. His mouth opened a little, and he looked at Gatsby and then back at Daisy as if he had just recognized her as someone he knew a long time ago." Now, they told each other they loved each other with their eyes. This wasn't like a direct thing that was said in front of Tom, but he catches on. And now things take a major change. So if we're doing like our rising action thing, we're at the point now where it's really starting to ramp up. And that's going to be an issue. Okay. I'm trying to follow my notes over here, so I apologize for being a little disjointed. Now things get really awkward. They decide they're going to go to town. Let me mute that. They decide they're going to go to town because, again, that's like getting it off of Tom's territory, it really is. Although going to his apartment in New York, I don't know if that's much better. But I think Daisy decides, let's go there, because remember we talked earlier, New York City represents a thing where anything can happen. And so this is where they're going to go, and this is going to finally come to a climax, okay? Gatsby seems to be thinking a little bit now. We already noticed when he first got with Daisy, there was some hesitance about whether he really wanted this, at least the way it is. And now he makes a comment that I think is meant to be negative. I don't know. Some people have told me that they don't think so, but he says that Daisy's voice is full of money. And then they describe it as like being a sing-songy, like the way money jingles type of thing. But I don't think telling someone their voice is full of money sounds like a positive. It sounds to me like it's like she's a gold digger type statement, okay? At this point, Tom pulls a power play. Gatsby talks about, hey, why don't you follow me? I'm going to drive my car. And Tom's like, hey, how about I drive your car? And I'll take Daisy. Like, it's really like I said, it's a I'm the man in this situation move. But then Daisy just smacks him with it. She's like, no, you take Jordan and Nick. I'll ride with Gatsby. So at this point, Tom is definitely getting crazy. We know how upset he can get and how he can fly off the handle. So this is not boding well. All right. On the way, Tom's going to rant about Gatsby being fake. Tom knows the truth, but he's not going to completely reveal it until later in this chapter. But he knows that Gatsby's not who he says he is, and he wants to rant about that. And Jordan kind of pokes him about it. She's like, well, if you don't like him so much, why did you invite him with us? And Tom obviously points out it wasn't my call. It was Daisy's. They decide to stop and fill up gas, and this is a bad move on their part. They decide to stop at, well, they're going through the Valley of Ashes. Where would they stop? Well, they stop at the Wilsons' garage. And so this is going to definitely end up with problems, all right? We see George come up. Let me read a little bit about him. George comes up, and we see this. He looks beat down. He looks sick. He looks like something's wrong. And it is, because he's started to piece together something's up with his wife. And he's begging Tom to reconsider the car deal, which Tom had called off. And he says, I can make money on that deal. And Tom says, what do you want money for all of a sudden? Well, I've been here too long. I want to get away. My wife and I want to go west. Your wife does? Exclaimed Tom. She's been talking about it for 10 years. He rested for a moment against the pump, shading his eyes. And now she's going whether she wants to or not. I'm going to get her away. So Tom's surprised. He's like, wait, she wants to leave? Because he's still under the impression that she wants to be with him. And I want you to know that Tom gets upset about the fact that she's leaving. So, we can imagine that based on the scene we saw way back in chapter 2, that he doesn't really love her. Like she's just his, side chick, I guess. But he's not. He loves her too. He cares about her. He knows that Gatsby and Daisy have a thing, and he's upset. But when he finds out that Myrtle's about to leave, he really gets upset. All right. Now, obviously, George knows something's up. He wants to take her away so he can get her out of this place and go out west. And again, the going out west is the poor man's dream. Everything's different when we go out there. Just like our country was settled by people who were going across the ocean, going west. That has always been an image of moving on to, all this potential out there. All right. Now, listen to this. We get a lot of really cool prose passages here. So at this point, they're leaving the gas station, and listen to this section. This is Nick just kind of thinking. So I realized that so far his suspicions hadn't alighted on Tom. He had discovered that... I'm sorry, this is about George, not Tom. I realized that so far his suspicions hadn't alighted on Tom. He had discovered that Myrtle had some sort of life apart from him in another world, and the shock had made him physically sick. I stared at him and then at Tom, who had made a parallel discovery less than an hour before, and it occurred to me that there was no difference between men in intelligence or race so profound as the difference between the sick and the well. Wilson was so sick that he looked guilty, unforgivably guilty, as if he had just got some poor girl with child. So notice Nick makes a kind of a connection that there's really not a difference between these two guys, even though they have a difference in their financial means. They're both unhappy, and they're both in situations that they don't know if they can control, and it's causing them issues. The only difference is it's made Wilson physically ill. That's how much he cares about his wife. And that's not the case with Tom at this point, okay? Tom decides at that point, hey, you can have the car. He's like, you can have it. Like, he's just going to give it to him. Because Tom feels bad. He starts to realize that him and Wilson, he may not want to admit it, him and Wilson are very similar. He and Wilson are very similar. Then something really weird happens. Great writing. Okay, and again, you could miss it if you're not careful. It says, over the ash heaps, the giant eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg kept their vigil, but I perceived after a moment that other eyes were regarding us with peculiar intensity from less than 20 feet away. Now, as this section ends, the next paragraph tells you those eyes belong to Myrtle. Myrtle's looking out from the window, and she sees Tom out there. But the thing is she also sees Jordan. She doesn't know anything about Jordan and Nick or what this situation is. She just thinks it's another woman she's having to share Tom with, and this is going to push her over the edge. We're going to come back to her in just a little bit. So now Tom's pretty upset. He's driving. It says he found out that his wife and his mistress, until an hour ago, secured and Violet, were slipping precipitously from his control. So he starts to realize, I'm losing control of this life I've built. And he's been happy. He's got his wife at home that represents his, East egg stuff, but then he's also got his mistress on the side that allows him to be who he wants to be. And he's about to lose both of them. So he's pretty upset. So they get to the apartment, and Daisy's complaining about being hot, and Tom is understandably angry at this point and kind of snaps at her. And this is the point where Gatsby steps in and makes a mistake and decides he's going to take up for Daisy. And and Tom is having none of it. Okay, I think I may have mixed up a few names in there. I apologize. I'm talking fast and my brain's working at a different speed. It's Tom and Gatsby are about to have this confrontation, okay? Tom's snapping at Daisy. Daisy is upset. Gatsby steps in and he's like, hey, and he calls him old sport, which that's, his go-to for everybody. Gatsby starts pointing out at this point that they go through this discussion about some details from Tom and Daisy's wedding, which, kind of is important that they drop that in there, because that's definitely a jab at Gatsby, because it's once again stuff that Gatsby wants to ignore that ever happened. All right. Sorry, let me move this up a little bit. Then Tom has had enough, and he decides to confront Gatsby on his lies, particularly about Oxford. Now, Gatsby has an answer for it, and he kind of tells him, no, I was there. I went because I had basically a GI Bill that allowed me to go, that sort of thing. And that kind of shuts it down for a minute. And then Tom says something, man. Listen to this. Self-control, repeated Tom incredulously. I suppose the latest thing is to sit back and let Mr. Nobody from nowhere make love to your wife. Well, if that's the idea, you can count me out. Nowadays, people begin by sneering at family life and family institutions, and next they'll throw everything overboard and have intermarriage between black and white. Goodness, Tom. So Tom gets mad, And he points out what really bugs him about Gatsby is that he's not from somewhere. So we know that's the East Egg mentality. And he points out how, it's a shame that people are like ignoring the traditions in the family life, which of course we know he's doing too. Which, no offense, tends to be an upper class sentimentality, is that, everyone else is destroying the things that our country's built on while they sit at home and do it too. And then he pulls in his racism again, because, we just have to Fitzgerald doesn't want us to like feel too much for Tom here. There's a danger here that you could all of a sudden start sympathizing with Tom, which we're not meant to do. So the racism kind of regrounds that. Let's see, what else do we have? Okay, now this next passage, for the next 4 pages, there's just so much to cover, and I know I'm going to read a lot of it, and I'm 15 minutes. We're still doing good. I've got something to tell you, old sport, began Gatsby, but Daisy guessed at his intention. Please don't, she interrupted helplessly. Please, let's all go home. Why don't we all go home? So Daisy, for some reason, doesn't want this to happen like they thought it was going to. But Tom's not having any of it. He says, I want to know what Mr. Gatsby has to tell me. Well, your wife doesn't love you, said Gatsby. She's never loved you. She loves me. You must be crazy, exclaimed Tom automatically. Gatsby sprang to his feet, vivid with excitement. She never loved you, do you hear? He cried. She only married you because I was poor and she was tired of waiting for me. It was a terrible mistake, but in her heart she never loved anyone except me. Now, the fact they end up together, and parts of this are true, but Gatsby seems intent on going over the fact that Daisy never loved Tom. Now, everything he says in here is probably true, but there's this question of, can you love 2 people? In Gatsby's mind, you can't. You can only love one. But it seems like Daisy and Tom show us that they, in their world at least, you can. There's a little bit more, and then it says, I told you what's been going on, said Gatsby. Going on for 5 years, and you didn't know. Tom turned to Daisy sharply. You've been seeing this fellow for 5 years? Not seeing, said Gatsby. No, we couldn't meet, but both of us loved each other all that time, old sport, and you didn't know. I used to laugh sometimes if there was no laughter in his eyes, to think that you didn't know. Oh, that's all? Tom tapped his thick fingers together like a clergyman and leaned back in his chair. Now, Tom knows he's got him right there, because Gatsby's like, we've been in love for 5 years, even though we haven't been together. And Tom's like, that's not what you think. You're crazy, he exploded. I can't speak about anything that happened 5 years ago because I didn't know Daisy then, and I'll be if I see how you got within a mile of her unless you brought the groceries to the back door. But all the rest of that's a blank lie. Daisy loved me when she married me, and she loves me now. Now, Tom's also telling the truth probably here, because despite Daisy being upset, it doesn't mean she didn't still have feelings for Tom. Now, maybe on the wedding day, we saw already there was some hesitation there, but she eventually grows to, for whatever reason, whatever these people consider love, she grew to love him, I think. Gatsby cannot accept that, though, because if it does, it erodes what he wanted. No, said Gatsby, shaking his head. She does, though. The trouble is that sometimes she gets foolish ideas in her head and doesn't know what she's doing. He nodded sagely. And what's more, I love Daisy, too. Once in a while I go off on a spree and make a fool of myself, but I always come back, and in my heart I love her all the time. Now, we look at that as a pretty, no, you don't. If you cheat on your wife, you don't love her. And I would agree with that statement. But it just feels like to Tom, I think he's telling the truth as much as he can. He truly does love his wife. But again, part of this is being forced into this type of life, and it's just not what he wants. It's one of the problems we have with forcing people to accept roles that they really don't want, despite what their, class level might be or their socioeconomic status or whatever. We force people down pathways that they don't want to take, and bad things happen. Now, Daisy tries to stand up to Tom right here, but this all starts to go south. Gatsby says, just tell him the truth that you never loved him and it's all wiped out forever. And she struggles spitting this out. She finally does say, I never loved him, but listen to the next part. She said with perceptible reluctance. So she's really struggling to get the words out because she did love him. I mean, love is a lot messier than we portray it. It's not The Notebook. That nonsense is not what it's about. I mean, that's a great fictional story, probably. I don't know. I don't care about it, but some of you do. But this is more realistic. Love's messy, it's confusing, and that's the problem we're facing here. And all these people keep cheating on each other and treating each other wrong. So their concept for love is probably all sorts of damaged. She finally turns to Gatsby and says, you want too much, she cried to Gatsby. I love you now. Isn't that enough? I can't help what's past. She began to sob helplessly. I did love him once, but I loved you too. She points out, I love you now. Why does it have to be the past that you get? That's what's important to you. And, That's a great question. Gatsby's eyes opened and closed. You loved me too? He repeated. Even that's a lie, said Tom savagely. She didn't know you were alive. Why, there's things between Daisy and me that you'll never know, things that neither of us can ever forget. And he's not wrong there either. She says, even alone, I can't say I never loved Tom, she admitted in a pitiful voice. It wouldn't be true. So, and I'm skipping a few lines here and there that are unimportant, but I'm giving you the high points here. Daisy's like, I love you now, but I loved Tom once before. And in a way, I still love him now. But she wants to be with Gatsby. He could still have her if he would just shut up and quit trying to push this agenda that just can't happen. You can't recapture the past. He points out, this is Gatsby, says, Daisy's leaving you. Nonsense. I am, though, she said with visible effort. Notice, she says with visible effort, meaning she's struggling to get this out. Tom knows he's won at this point. He knows Daisy's not going anywhere. He knows Gatsby's through, and he's going for the throat. She's not leaving me. Tom's words suddenly leaned down over Gatsby. Certainly not for a common swindler who'd have to steal the ring he put on her finger. And now Tom's going to pull out his ace in the hole. He's about to drop on Daisy the truth of Gatsby and where he really came from. So he points out the whole Wolfsheim connection. He points out that Gatsby's really a criminal, and that's something Daisy just can't seem to abide. And that Daisy can't abide. Gatsby tries to reason with her and begs her to, reconsider, but at this point, she's done. She kind of, is already starting to gravitate back towards Tom. We can see it. They decide to leave, and Tom at this point lets Gatsby drive with Daisy. He's like, I'm not worried about it. That fling's done. And he's right. I mean, he's won the battle. Gatsby's toast, so they decide to leave. At this point on the way out, Nick remembers something that seems really weird. He says, I just remember that today's my birthday. I was 30. Before me stretched the portentous, menacing road of a new decade. Hey, this difference between 20 to 30 is a huge deal for lots of people. Because, in your 20s, you're still young. You're considered at your peak. The 30s, you hit your life proper. And at this point, married, starting on a family. Of course, Nick's done none of that. And he just realized that now I've got a lot more expectations on me as I hit my 30s. And listen to this beautiful prose. He says, 30. The promise of a decade of loneliness, a thinning list of single men to know, a thinning briefcase of enthusiasm, thinning hair. But there was Jordan beside me, who, unlike Daisy, was too wise ever to carry well-forgotten dreams from age to age. As we passed over the dark bridge, her wan face fell lazily against my coat's shoulder, and the formidable stroke of 30 died away with the reassuring pressure of her hand. So we drove on toward death through the cooling twilight. So, Nick's really struggling with this. I'm 30, and I didn't even realize it until right now, and I have a future that's going to be a decline from here on. And then, did you catch drove on toward death through the cooling twilight? Now, here it may seem like Nick's talking about getting older, but that's not what happens. Because what happens in the next section? Well, this is like I would say, if we want to be honest, the climactic moment in this story. I mean, a lot of people might put it later, but I feel like this is it. Okay, we get a weird shift in tone as we meet a minor character named a Greek man named Michaelis. I probably mispronounced his name. Sorry about that. But he's brought in to tell us about something that happened that honestly Fitzgerald can't present because Nick's not there when this happens. So somehow we have to get this information. And how it's conveyed is through a courtroom setting, and Michaelis is telling what he knows. And basically he's telling us about what happened when, apparently George and Myrtle have a fight. Myrtle runs out in the street, and about that time, a big yellow car, Gatsby's car, drives through and hits her, and she's killed immediately. Now, interestingly enough, the people there initially say they thought the car was a green color. Now, remember, what that should be for. That's a little bit of a hint at who's actually driving the car, because green is a color associated with Daisy, the green light, money, the fact that she's, the jealousy. Green is associated with jealousy, and then of course the car now is green. So we get a hint, the good readers do, that it's not Gatsby driving the car right now. Okay, all right. So we get through that. The next section is when Tom and Nick and Jordan all get there, and Tom's noticeably upset, but he's got to hide it. And he sees George, who is beyond distraught. He barely can make sense. He runs up to comfort him, and we do get this point where Tom again looks kind of sympathetic here. We definitely feel bad for George, but we never stop feeling bad for him. And then we find out that the car was actually yellow, not green. So Tom is under the impression that it's Gatsby that hit her, and he's pretty furious about that because the car didn't even bother stopping. It kept on driving. Okay. And then we get to this really awkward scene as this chapter's about to close. We get back to the house, to Tom and Daisy's house, and Nick refuses to go in. He's like, I'll wait out here for a cab. Nick is definitely in his I'm not judgmental, but I am judgmental stage. He says, I'd had enough of all of them for one day, and suddenly that included Jordan too. She must have seen something of this in my expression, for she turned abruptly away and ran up the porch steps into the house. I sat down for a few minutes with my head in my hands until I heard the phone taken up inside and the butler's voice calling a taxi. Then I walked slowly down the drive away from the house, intending to wait by the gate. He refuses to even go in the house because he's like so tired of these people, and he means all of them, including Gatsby, who he runs into next. All right, he sees Gatsby hanging out in the bushes, who's apparently been watching things as stalkery as can be. And he says, this is Nick, he says, I disliked him so much by this time that I didn't find it necessary to tell him he was wrong. So at this point, he is just dislikes Gatsby. He doesn't like Jordan. He doesn't like Tom and Daisy. He's had enough of all this rich people drama. And he finally clicks and he asks, was Daisy the one driving? And yes, he said after a moment, but of course I'll say I was. So he's going to take the heat for her, even though all this nonsense just went down, and she's obviously not going to stay with him. But he acts like, well, I'll go to jail for her. Because, to be honest, what's he got now? He did everything in his life was about getting Daisy back. He got her back. He messed around. He lost her. What's next for this guy? All right? It almost seems like Daisy hits her on purpose, just for the record. I don't know if that's the case, but there's sure enough ambiguity to make you think that maybe it did. All right? Then we see this really interesting scene as this section closes. And we see Tom and Daisy sitting at a table, and Gatsby's just watching it from outside, and I guess Nick's still there. It says they weren't happy, and neither of them had touched the chicken or ale, the stuff that they have there, and yet they weren't unhappy either. This sums up so many marriages, especially the ones we see here. Tom and Daisy are not happy together. They really would be happier if they could be with the people they truly wanted to be with. But the fact is they've got each other, and honestly, they're not unhappy either. And Fitzgerald's really pointing to something about love. Love is not something that's always gonna, be the best thing in your life. There's days it's gonna be hard work. There's days it's gonna be blah. But a lot of the time, it's about a good relationship is not just so much where you're happy with each other every day, but at least you can avoid being unhappy most of the time. Now, I'm not saying I agree. I am a little more romantic of a person than that. That's kind of a pessimistic statement, but it makes sense considering the background that Fitzgerald had, why he would think this way. So, and then look at the comparison here. Now, you have to think about this. And again, this is something that occurred to me after years of studying this book. The last sentence, I walked away and left him standing there in the moonlight watching over nothing. When we first see Gatsby, we see him in the moonlight looking at that green light stretching across to it. Now when we see him, we're walking away from him and he's still in the moonlight, and this time he's looking at nothing. Although he's literally looking in their window, but that dream, that green light has been shut off for him and he has nothing. Okay? Now, for me, the death of Myrtle and the death of this dream of Gatsby's is really your climax. And now we have to deal with the falling action, which is going to be, what happens with, George. Is Tom going to confront Gatsby about Myrtle's death? Is anything going to come out where Daisy was involved? What happens with Nick and Jordan? How does Nick end up? All these questions have to be answered, and those would all be part of the falling action. So that will end today's lesson, and right at 30 minutes, so it's better than I thought, to be honest. Now, I'm going to stop this, go back and do some review and post this for you guys in a little bit. Like I said, as I'm viewing this right now, there's a massive lag, but it looked like it wasn't when I did a replay test earlier. So we're going to hope and pray that this is right. If it's not, you know the drill. Just listen to it and ignore my ugly face, okay? And that'll help you pay attention, all right? Okay, guys, thank you so much for your time. I hope that you're, having a wonderful evening, and I hope to talk to you again soon as we get into Chapter 8 and start coming to a close in this book.